Welcome to another deep dive. We know you're here because you want to grasp complex topics, like really understand them,
Yeah.
and without getting bogged down in all the technical stuff.
That's what we aim for, yeah.
So today we're tackling something super interesting about how language actually works. It's called, well, it has a bit of a technical name, phonological alternations.
Phonological, meaning like sound related.
Yeah, exactly, sound related.
Hmm.
And alternations meaning like they're changing. It's kind of like a secret code within language that tells us how these sounds shift and adapt.
Yeah, they're like these hidden sound changes that occur when a word changes form. So, for instance, how a word is pronounced might change when you make it plural or when you add a different ending to a verb, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Like maybe you've noticed how the vowel sound in sing shifts to sang in the past tense.
Exactly. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. And to really get to the bottom of this, we've been poring over research on how linguists, those language detectives, figure out these patterns, these like almost hidden rules.
And they look at all sorts of languages, right?
Yeah.
Not just English.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Today we'll be looking at examples from a whole bunch of languages. I mean, we're talking Serbo-Croatian, Tengal, Karok, Icelandic, Chukchi, Yawamani,
Wow, that's quite a list.
Livonian, and even some Algonquian languages.
It's incredible to think about the sheer diversity of human language and how these phonological alternations are at play in each and every one of them.
Totally.
So the real mission here, the deep dive, as you will, is to figure out, alongside these linguists, how they actually pinpoint those original, like the foundational forms of words. Like, what do they really look like before all these sound changes happen?
Yeah, and what are those rules, those almost mathematical rules in a way, that are causing all these changes?
We're peeling back the layers, right?
Totally. Uncovering the hidden systems behind, like, how we speak.
Right. So to kick things off, let's take a look at Serbo-Croatian. It's a great language to start with because it really clearly shows how sounds shift depending on the grammatical context, especially with adjectives describing things.
Right, right. So Serbo-Croatian has grammatical genders for nouns like masculine, feminine, and neuter, and then plurals, of course. And depending on the gender and number of the noun, the adjective takes on different endings. We're talking endings like A for feminine or O for neuter and I for plural.
Oh, so the adjective changes its form to match the noun it's describing.
Exactly, yeah. And that's where those sound changes, those alternations come into play. But first, we have to understand this interesting rule they have about where the accent, the stress in a word, falls.
Stress. Like which syllable is emphasized when you say it.
Yeah, exactly, the emphasis. They have these words called oxytones. Big word, I know.
It is a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, but it just means words where the stress falls on the last syllable, basically, at the end of the word. And there's a rule. If a vowel is at the very end of the word, maybe with some consonants before it, that vowel gets the stress.
Okay, so that's how they decide where the stress goes in most words.
In most, yeah. But there are also some words where the stress falls in, well, seemingly unpredictable places. Like, it doesn't follow that rule. But for our purposes today, we're going to just focus on the ones that do follow the rules.
Sounds good.
Okay, good. Now, here's a little puzzle that pops up in Serbo-Croatian. Sometimes you'll see an L sound, that L sound, in a word, and sometimes you'd expect an O sound instead, and vice versa. They seem to swap places, these two sounds.
Okay, can you give me an example of that?
Sure, yeah. The word for fat is debeo, but that's just for masculine nouns. When you're talking about a feminine noun, the word changes to debella, you see. The O becomes an L.
Oh, I see. That's pretty interesting. It's like they're almost related, but with this little shift.
Exactly, and this pattern pops up again and again. You have pusustao and posustala, which means faltered, beo and bella for white, mio and mila for deer, and seu and sella for whole. The O and al sounds seem to alternate.
So this begs the question, right? Which one is the original sound? Is it the O that sometimes changes to L, or is it the L that becomes O? Like, which one is the more basic form?
That's the million-dollar question, and luckily the clues in the language itself point pretty strongly to the L being the underlying form.
Interesting. So how do they figure that out? Like, what makes them think it's the L?
Well, for a couple of reasons. First off, it's a matter of, how natural the sound changes. It's actually quite common for an L sound at the end of a word to kind of shift toward a back vowel sound like O or U.
Okay.
Think about the English word milk. To some people, that final L can sound a bit like a U, kind of blend it in.
Oh, yeah, I can hear that. It's almost like the L is losing its consonantness and becoming more vowel-like.
Exactly. And this tendency for liquids, which is what linguists call sounds like L and R, to become more vowel-like at the ends of words, it makes sense from how we use our mouths. It's just easier sometimes to let that ill kind of melt into a vowel. But the opposite, like an O changing into an L.
Yeah, that sounds harder, like less natural.
Much, much less natural. In fact, it's almost unheard of in languages. So just based on the sheer plausibility of the sound change, starting with an L makes a lot more sense.
Okay, so that's one reason.
Yeah.
But you said there was another.
Yeah, and this one is really cool because it ties back to the inner workings of Serbo-Croatian grammar. Remember that rule about oxytones and where the stress falls?
Yep. The stress goes on the final vowel unless the word has an unpredictable stress pattern.
Right. Well, it turns out that when that O sound comes from an L, like in the word beo, which, it comes from that base bell, yeah, right?
What?
That O doesn't get the stress. It's like the accent rule just skips right over it.
Okay, so if the stress usually goes on the final vowel, why wouldn't it in beo?
That's the clue. The fact that the accent rule ignores that particular O tells us something about the underlying form. It suggests that at the point when the accent rule is doing its thing, there's actually a consonant there, the O. And in Serbo-Croatian, consonants can't carry stress.
Ah, so the stress rule applies before the L changes to O. That makes sense.
It does, doesn't it? It all falls into place. So we can almost see the process happening step by step. If you start with, say, the underlying form bell, well, first the accent rule kicks in and assigns stress to the E. That gives us bell. Then, and only then, does that final O turn into an O, and boom, you have bell.
Wow. I love how those two things support each other. The sound change itself and the way the grammar works, it all fits. Okay, so we've got the O changing to O. What other cool sound shifts are happening in Serbo-Croatian?
Well, there's another one that's super interesting. Sometimes in a sound, that ah sound just vanishes. Like it's completely
On, like it just disappears.
Yep, poof. Linguists use the symbol A to show that something has been deleted, so we're talking about it changing to A. And you can see it when you compare different forms of the same adjective, like leaden, masculine for ice, and ledna, feminine for ice. See how the A is there in the masculine, but not in the feminine?
Oh, yeah, I see. It's the same with dobar and dobra. Good.
Flip.
Jason and jasna for...
Yeah.
So what's going on here? It seems like the A just gets deleted when it's between certain consonants. Like maybe when it's squeezed in between a vowel and a consonant. I mean, we even have that in English sometimes, like when separate becomes separate.
That's a really good observation, and at first glance, it seems like a pretty logical explanation. Vowel deletion is a fairly common process in languages. But here's the thing, there's a bit of a twist in the Serbo-Croatian story.
Oh, what's the twist?
Well, it turns out there are words in Serbo-Croatian that follow a consonant, vowel, consonant pattern, like CVCAC. And in these words, the A doesn't get deleted even when you add those endings. So it's not just about the surrounding sounds.
Okay, so if it's not simply being deleted, what's the alternative?
That's where things get really interesting. Linguists propose that the sound that's actually there in the underlying form isn't an A at all. It's something else entirely. It.
A dep? What's that?
It's a, how do I explain this? It's a voiced viller, fricative. Think of it like the A in some pronunciations of the Scottish word loch.
Like the Loch Ness Monster.
Exactly, yeah. But in this case, your vocal cords are vibrating. So it's a sound made way back in your throat.
Okay, so we have this hidden two. What happens to it?
Well, instead of disappearing, it transforms. It becomes through a process called epenthesis. Remember, that means inserting a sound. And this epenthesis happens in a very specific context. When the two is at the end of a word, and it's following a consonant cluster that ends in a sonorant sound.
Hold on, remind me, what's a sonorant again?
A sonorant is a sound that's made with a fairly open vocal tract, so the air can flow pretty freely. It's like and vowels, of course, are sonorants too. It's the opposite of sounds like PKs, which are called obstruents, where the airflow is more blocked.
Gotcha. So it's all about the company the so keeps, right?
Exactly. Serbo-Croatian doesn't like to have certain types of consonant combinations at the very end of words. So if you have a consonant followed by a sonorant consonant, and then this the language basically goes, nope, too crowded, and throws in an ow to smooth things out.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It's like the A is there to make the word flow better. So, okay, let's apply this to dubar. Would the underlying form be dobram?
You got it. And then because that to finds itself after a consonant, the R, and before the end of the word, poof, it turns into an A and, or wait, no, it already is an A, so the underlying form is just dober.
And that explains why the A doesn't affect where the stress falls.
Exactly. It's all about the order of operations.
Right, the accent rule does its thing before that A even shows up. So the stress goes on the first syllable, and then later the epithetic A just kind of pops in at the end. Amazing how it all works out.
It really is. And we can see how this epenthesis interacts with the il tuo rule we talked about earlier, too.
Oh, how so?
We'll take the word okrugo, which is the masculine for round, if we assume the underlying form is okrugal.
Which would make sense because the feminine is okrugla.
Right, exactly. So we have okrugo, and to get to the masculine okrugo, the epenthesis rule has to apply first. It inserts the A because of that final consonant cluster, ajul, which gives us okrugal.
Okay, so it breaks up the consonant cluster.
Exactly. Then that final A, now that it's all by itself at the end of the word, can change to an O, and boom, we have okrugo.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
So the order in which the rules happen, it's like crucial.
Absolutely crucial, yeah. And this okruga example really reinforces a couple of key ideas. First, the ale sound being a sonorant consonant just like R and N, it also triggers that A insertion. This gives more weight to the idea that sounds can be grouped together based on shared features.
Like they belong to the same club, the sonorant consonant club.
Exactly, yeah. Linguists call these natural classes. And the second point is that this epenthesis rule, it's not just about what we hear on the surface. It needs information about the deeper structure, the fact that that O sound in okrugo actually came from an L. It's working on a more abstract level.
That is pretty wild. So just to summarize, so far we've got these three rules in Serbo-Croatian. The accent rule, the rule for inserting an A after certain consonant combinations, and the rule for changing O to O at the end of a word.
Right, and the order in which they apply, like we said, is super important. And, as linguists try to figure out these underlying forms and rules, there are a few guiding principles they follow. They try to avoid having exceptions, right? They want the rules to make sense from, like, a phonetic standpoint, like how we actually make sounds with our mouths.
Keep it natural, right?
Exactly. And they have to consider how the explanation for one change might affect others. Like, how does that insertion rule mesh with the accent rule? It's all about finding the most elegant and internally consistent solution, yeah.
Okay, so we've seen how the order in which rules apply is really important. But what happens when one rule actually paves the way for another rule to apply, or even blocks another rule from happening?
Ah, that's where things get even more interesting. We're entering the world of feeding and bleeding rule relationships.
Feeding and bleeding sounds a bit intense.
The terms might sound a bit dramatic, but they just describe how rules interact. So a feeding relationship is when one rule sets up the perfect conditions for another rule to apply. It creates an opportunity, we could say.
Okay, can you give me a real-world example of that?
Absolutely. Let's take a trip over to Nigeria where they speak Tangal. Now, Tangal has this cool thing where the final consonant of a noun can actually change depending on whether it's followed by certain little words that indicate possession, like the, my, your, his, and her. We're talking about like whether the consonant is voiced like a DDG or voiceless like a PTK.
Oh, so the sound of the consonant can shift depending on what comes after it.
Exactly. Yeah. And what's interesting is that this difference between voiced and voiceless consonants, it might not be noticeable when the noun is just by itself, standing alone.
Oh, so you might not hear the difference unless it's followed by one of these possessive markers.
Right, right. But when you add those possessive markers, that difference can pop right back up. Like they have a rule that specifically says if a voiceless consonant is followed by, within the same part of the word, a voice sonorant sound, it becomes voiced.
Okay, and remind me, sonorant, that's like ooh, ooh.
Yeah, exactly. Those smooth sounds. Okay, so we've got that voicing rule. Now, here's the other piece of the puzzle. The possessive suffixes themselves can undergo voicing changes too.
Oh, the suffixes themselves change. How so?
Well, like the your suffix has two forms, ok and ugo, and the her suffix can be ok or dudo. Which form gets used depends on whether the sound before it at the very end of the noun is voiced or voiceless.
So it's like a matching game, a sound matching game.
Totally, yeah.
Yep.
If the noun ends in a voiced sound, you use the voice suffix, and if it ends in a voiceless sound, you use the voiceless suffix. And there's a rule for that. Basically, a consonant in the suffix, like the K or the T, will take on the voicing of the consonant that comes right before it.
That's actually pretty neat. It's like they're harmonizing with each other.
Yeah, exactly. Now here's where the feeding comes in. Sometimes Tangale has a rule that deletes the final vowel of a noun when you add a suffix. So, like wudo, which means tooth, it loses its o and becomes wood before the definite article suffix, which is e. It's like saying the tooth in Tangale. Or litu, for bag, becomes lit before the same suffix. So that final vowel gets elided, chopped off.
Okay, I'm with you so far. So how does this vowel deletion, this elision, feed into that voicing rule for the suffixes?
Well, think about it. Because the final vowel of wudo is deleted, the consonant in the possessive suffix, like o for your, ends up right next to the last consonant of the root word, the d. And this triggers that voicing rule in the suffix, so you get would go instead of, say, would co.
Ah, so the vowel deletion sets the stage for the voicing rule to happen.
Exactly, yeah. It's like a domino effect. But sometimes it can go the other way, leading to what we call counterfeeding.
Counterfeeding, okay, so the opposite.
Kind of, yeah. Like if we take the word litu for bag again, and we add the suffix no for my, the final vowel gets deleted. And you'd think that would create a situation where the voiceless T should become voiced before that N, which is a voice sonorant, right?
Yeah, following the rule we just talked about.
Right, but that doesn't happen. You get litno, not lidno. The elision actually prevents that voicing rule from happening, so it counterfeeds it.
So feeding is when one rule creates an opportunity for another, and counterfeeding is when it blocks that opportunity. Interesting.
Exactly. Now, bleeding, on the other hand, is when one rule eliminates the conditions needed for another rule to apply. It kind of cuts off the supply, so to speak.
Cuts off the supply. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Let's look at another example, this time from Karok, a Native American language. Karok has a rule that says an ez sound turns into a shu sound when it comes after an I sound.
Like a palatalization rule, right? Where the sound moves toward the palate.
Precisely, yeah. But Karok also has a rule that simplifies things by deleting one of two vowels that happen to be right next to each other, kind of like what we saw with the Tangle vowel deletion.
Okay, I'm following. So how do these two rules, the S2 and the vowel deletion, interact?
Well, let's take the word for jump, which is iskak. Linguists think the underlying form is actually hashtag uskak. Now, if that vowel deletion rule happens first, it gets rid of the first I, leaving us with uskak.
Okay.
And because the I is gone, the rule that changes is to she can't apply anymore. The es is no longer next to an I. So the vowel deletion has actually bled the palatalization rule. It's cut off its supply.
Ah, I get it. So it's like the vowel deletion has removed the environment that the palatalization rule needs to operate.
Exactly. Now let's look at another word, uksip, which means point. When you add the prefix nai, meaning I, the underlying form becomes hashtag nisippak.
Oh.
Now watch what happens. If we apply the vowel deletion rule, it takes out the U, which brings the I from the prefix right next to the es, and now
the conditions are perfect for the es to become shh.
Bingo, you get nehip. So in this case, the vowel deletion has actually fed the palatalization rule. It's set it up.
Okay, so it really all depends on the specific sequence of events.
That's exactly it. The same two rules can have completely different relationships depending on what word they're acting on and which one applies first.
And just to round things out,
Yeah.
What about counterbleeding?
Ah, that's where things get even trickier. Our source mentions Icelandic as an example, where they have rules about deleting certain glide sounds like Y and W sounds, and then other rules about inserting sounds like we talked about with epinthesis.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, even though a rule seems like it should remove the conditions for a second rule to apply, that second rule still manages to sneak in and do its thing. It's like it finds a way, even though the environment seems to have changed.
That's pretty sneaky.
Yeah, that's counterbleeding for you. It highlights how intricate and subtle the interactions between these rules can be.
Absolutely. It's mind-boggling to think about how much is happening beneath the surface when we speak.
Okay, so we've talked about feeding and bleeding. These ideas of rules working together, or sometimes against each other, it really underscores the idea that when we speak, words don't just pop out fully formed.
Right. It's not like we have a mental dictionary with all the pronunciations pre-recorded. It's a process, right?
Exactly, a multi-step process. It suggests that there might be these like hidden intermediate stages as we go from the underlying form, the kind of abstract blueprint of a word, to the final pronunciation that comes out of our mouths.
Yeah, it's like the word is undergoing a series of transformations guided by these rules before it reaches its final form.
And this idea, this kind of stepwise process, it contrasts with a simpler view, where the underlying form and the spoken form are seen as like equal and rules just apply to either one. But the evidence from all these sound alternations really points to a more dynamic system.
A system with these intermediate representations. It's like an assembly line. An assembly line for words. I love that analogy. Okay, so are there like concrete examples that really demonstrate the need for these intermediate stages?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One of the classic examples is Canadian raising.
Canadian raising. Okay, tell me more about that.
So, in many dialects of Canadian English, the vowel sounds in words like type and house, they raise in your mouth, they shift to a slightly higher position when they come before a voiceless consonant, like the P in type and the S in house.
Oh, that's interesting. So the vowels sound different depending on what consonant follows them.
Exactly. Like the diphthong, like in type, it becomes more like E, and all, like in house, shifts to subtle but noticeable.
Subtle but important, right?
Very important. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. These same Canadian English speakers often have another rule where a tense sound becomes softer, kind of like a do or even a flap, which is that really quick tap of the tongue when it comes between two vowels.
Right, like how metal and metal can sound practically the same sometimes.
Exactly. Now, the way these two rules, the raising of the vowel and the softening of the T, interact in different varieties of Canadian English, it gives us a window into those intermediate stages.
Oh, I'm listening. What happens?
In some regions, speakers can still hear a difference between writer and writer. They sound distinct. And this suggests that the vowel raising happens before that T softening. So the T in writer is still a voiceless T when the vowel changes.
Okay, so the order matters.
It does. But in other regions, writer and writer sound exactly the same. They've merged. And this implies that the T softening is happening first, affecting both words, before that vowel raising rule has a chance to differentiate them.
Oh, wow. So the final pronunciation hinges on which rule gets applied first.
Precisely. And that's where those intermediate stages come in. There has to be a point where the vowel might have already been raised, but the T hasn't been softened yet. It's like a snapshot in the middle of the process.
It's amazing to think about all these steps happening, in our minds so effortlessly.
It really is, yeah. And this idea of intermediate representations pops up again in a Bantu language called Kiamu. They have a rule where high vowels, like I and U, turn into glides, like the Y sound in yes and the W sound in west, when they're followed by another vowel that's not high.
Okay, so the high vowels kind of like slide into these Y and W sounds.
Exactly, yeah. And Kiamu has these other rules too, like an M sound becoming a syllabic N, which means it carries its own vowel sound.
Okay.
When it comes before that glide, and a K can change into a chi sound, like in chair, also before that you glide, and then that you glide itself can disappear sometimes after a consonant.
So lots of sound changes going on in Kiamu.
Oh yeah, definitely. But here's the key. When you look at words like chengo, which means cloth hanger, and ovuli for umbrella, the way they're pronounced suggests that the I sound in the prefixes, kai and mi, first has to become that you glide through the rule we talked about. Then that you glide triggers the next change. The K becomes ch, and the M becomes that syllabic N, and only then, as a final step, does the you glide itself vanish.
Well, so it's a three-step process. First, the I becomes ye, then the I causes other sounds to change, and then it disappears itself.
Exactly, yeah. And if we try to explain these changes just by looking at the underlying form and the final pronunciation without that intermediate step with the glide, things would get really messy.
How so?
Well, we'd need one rule to explain how M becomes syllabic and before an I that's followed by a non-high vowel, and then a completely separate rule for how K becomes chit under those same conditions. It just doesn't feel as elegant. But if we posit that ye glide as an intermediate step, it all makes sense. The Y is the common trigger for both changes. It's a much simpler and more parsimonious explanation.
Simpler and more elegant. I like that.
Yeah.
So the I glide is like the missing link.
Exactly, yeah. And this whole sequence really reinforces the idea that there's this level of representation, this intermediate stage where those combinations like K plus Y and M plus Y, they actually exist even if we don't actually hear them. They're part of the mental process.
Okay, so this is a really strong case for those intermediate steps. But are there any arguments against them?
Well, our source does point out that there can be other ways to explain these changes sometimes. Like in the case of Kiamu, you could argue that the palatal quality of that yeah glide, it just kind of gets absorbed into the preceding nasal, so it's still there, just kind of hidden within the sound. And with Canadian raising, there's a whole theory called lexical phonology, which proposes that some sound changes happen at a different level of representation, kind of like in the mental lexicon where we store words. And those changes might not necessarily need these strict intermediate stages.
Interesting. So it's not a completely settled issue then?
Not entirely, no. But in many cases, like the examples we talked about, those intermediate representations just make the most sense. They offer the most elegant and parsimonious explanation.
And they fit with the idea that language is a dynamic, rule-governed system, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so we've seen how individual sounds can change depending on their context. But what happens when a single unit of meaning, what linguists call a morpheme, is involved in multiple sound changes at the same time?
That's a great question, and it happens all the time in languages. Morphemes are often subject to several different sound changes simultaneously. It's like they're juggling multiple rules at once.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. Let's look at the Polish word for cart. It has two forms, ros in the singular and rosi in the plural.
Okay.
Now here we see two things happening at the same time. The O sound in Rosie changes to a U sound in Rose, and the final Z sound in Rosie, which is actually a voiced Z, like in zoo, becomes an S in Rose. It's devoiced.
Okay, so two changes at once.
But if we look at other related words in Polish, like the plural form worzy karts, we see that the underlying form is probably vos, with both the O and the voiced Z present. That's the form that shows up in the plural and gives us